The problem is that you're putting the cart before the horse. You've now passed out of this committee a 10-year moratorium on all AI regulation at the state level before you even have that framework.
And that's the problem. Does it make sense to regulate AI technologies on the national level so that businesses can follow one set of rules? Yeah, I think so. But is there any sign that Congress is working on such a law? No, none. Instead, the Republican Congress is attempting to just stop regulation of AI in the United States altogether for 10 years, and in an incredibly shady way, via dingleberry on the big beautiful bill.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, friend, and thank you for listening to the 318th episode of the listener-supported Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today's episode is actually going to be a follow-up to the last episode. The last episode was number 317, and it highlighted the worst provisions in Trump's Big Beautiful Bill. They actually named that thing the Big Beautiful Bill Act. But I still want you to listen to that episode, even though the Big Beautiful Bill is far from law, because as of the release date of this episode in mid-June 2025, the Senate still hasn't produced their version of the Big Beautiful Bill, and so there is still time to fight to get the worst of the House's version removed. But one of the provisions that I highlighted as one of the worst in the last episode is a provision that prohibits state and local regulation of artificial intelligence technologies for 10 years. And since we're going to go deep on this today, let's look at the actual provision. So, Section 43201, which is a provision that provides the federal government with $500 million to install artificial intelligence systems. Well, it also includes a section labeled Moratorium, which says, quote, "No state or political subdivision thereof may enforce, during the 10-year period beginning on the date of enactment of this act, any law or regulation of that state or a political subdivision thereof, restricting or otherwise regulating artificial intelligence models, artificial intelligence systems, or automated decision systems entered into interstate commerce," unquote. Now, I want to remind you and make this crystal clear. This is not law yet. But clearly, since this got dingleberried into the House version of the Big Beautiful Bill, there are people in Congress who want this. And by digging through the committee hearings list and watching a House Committee on Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Commerce, Manufacturing, and Trade hearing, which was held on May 21st, that was the day before the Big Beautiful Bill passed the House. Well, in that hearing, I found out who is pressuring Congress for this moratorium. I found out who in Congress put this in the bill, why they did it, and I found out who is against this and why. So basically, I got to eavesdrop on the conversation behind this AI tech dingleberry. And so today, I'm going to let you hear the highlights with all of the insufferable stuff removed. But before we get into the hearing, I need to give you some behind-the-scenes info about the funding model for this podcast. And one of the patterns that has emerged over the years with this semi-unique value-for-value funding model, where I produce a valuable piece of media and you pay whatever you think it's worth in return. Well, over the years, we have experienced the phenomenon of the guilty fan. This is the person who does not want to pay for the show, and who I think feels guilty when they hear the funding pitches. But this is a person who wants to listen to the show regularly, and so instead of paying, this person deals with their guilt by finding a reason to get big mad at me to justify not paying for the show. And one pattern in the communications from the guilty fan is that they always tell me to just take ads because every other podcast they listen to takes ads. And then this is usually followed up by a bunch of insults and unsolicited advice about how to run my business. And after a pretty long run of silence from the guilty fan community, I heard from one this week, and this email perfectly fit the pattern. And since it's been a while since I've done this, let's take a second to look at the arguments of our latest guilty fan so that I can explain why taking their advice would be the worst thing I could possibly do. because our latest version of the Guilty Fan recently sent a pretty insulting email that contained this paragraph, which I think contains a sentiment that in fact, I know, is shared by a lot of people who refuse to pay directly for this podcast, or at least have refused to pay so far. So here's the paragraph from the email. Quote, "The no sponsors thing is wearing way thin. I doubt that many of us out here buy that you couldn't find any sponsors in all of America who wouldn't give you editorial freedom, if you had enough listeners to make it worth it to them financially. Sign short-term contracts and cancel their asses vocally and online if they dare to try. You just don't have enough listeners because most of the new ones leave during the minute after minute of telethon that begins most of your episodes. No other podcast does this. And as for your regular listeners, those who are gonna give already do, and the rest of us almost certainly never will if we haven't already under the current regime," unquote. So, let's break this down. First of all, does Congressional Dish have enough listeners to attract advertisers? The answer to that is yes, by a lot. To attract advertisers in podcasting, you need to have about 5,000 downloads per episode, which is a threshold that we crossed a very long time ago. Now, I tried to find the exact date that we crossed it, but how download statistics are calculated and reported has changed multiple times. And so essentially my numbers before June of 2019 are gone. But we've been firmly over the advertising threshold since those standards were put in place. So that's well over 6 years, but I think it's more like 8 or 9 years. And I have been contacted by plenty of advertisers to the point that I block their emails. The desire of companies to pay me for your time certainly exists. But think about what creating contracts with them would entail. I'd have to schedule and conduct meetings with their representatives. Then I'd have to research their product and customer service practices to see if I would feel comfortable selling their product to you. Then I'd have to negotiate contracts, and I'd probably have to hire a lawyer to check those contracts. And then I'd have to work with those companies on scripts for what I would be paid to tell you, and then I'd have to record the ads and put them in the show. All of that work taking time and resources away from researching what Congress is doing and producing these episodes. But that extra work would be worth it for all the money, right? Well, no. Because you see, the really big podcasts with the celebrity hosts and or with corporate backing, they're able to negotiate individualized, lucrative contracts. So let's take the podcast Pivot with Professor Scott Galloway and Kara Swisher for an example. They have at least 6 ads in every episode, but the hosts aren't doing the work of negotiating ad contracts. They have both Vox and New York Magazine doing the business deals behind their massive show. Now let's compare that to Congressional Dish. You know that Congressional Dish is my personal passion project. I do have a small team of other companies whose services I pay for to help me, but there's no parent company doing any work or negotiations on my behalf. And so what that means in terms of advertising is that Congressional Dish would likely get offered what the vast majority of independent podcasts get offered, which are offers on the CPM model, which pays us based on how many thousands of people download each episode. Now, the average rate per 1,000 downloads in 2024 was between $15 and $30 per 1,000 downloads, a rate that has been going down over the years. And the rate you get depends on where the ad is placed in the episode. In order to get the higher rate, you have to interrupt your show and drop the ad in the middle. Ads at the beginning and at the end of the episodes, the ones that are less disruptive, those pay less. And even though we are in the top 5% of podcasts in the entire world based on our downloads per episode, we're still a small show. And so I just did the math. If I were to switch to taking ads in order for me to make the same per episode that I currently make, thanks to our producers who do pay for each episode on Patreon alone, I'd have to interrupt the episode 18 times to insert 18 ads, each of them between 30 seconds and 1 minute long, into the middle of the episode. And if I wanted to put all of the ads up front, like I do with these funding pitches, I'd have to insert 38 ads in the beginning of each episode. And so I ask you, do you want to listen to these episodes with 18 interruptions in the middle of them so that I can tell you about 18 different products instead of what Congress is up to? Or would you like me to start each episode with 38 ads in a row? Do you think that that would make this a better or worse listening and learning experience for you? So, you see, not taking ads, it isn't just an altruistic decision, although I really do love that our relationship is based on trust because I don't allow anyone to pay me to say anything to you. And I don't want to sell your time. None of that is bullshit. I love that about this business model, which is why I talk about it so much. But this business model is also a pragmatic financial decision. This business model is why I'm one of the rare, successful, full-time podcasters. And it's the reason I have been able to keep this going for 12 years with no end in sight. Quite frankly, financially, Congressional Dish crushes other similar-sized podcasts because of this business model, which, by the way, I didn't invent, and I'm far from the only one who does this. The masters of it are John C. Dvorak and Adam Curry on their podcast No Agenda, but others do similar things. They just call it listener-supported or donation-based instead of value for value. But this business model works. And I've been asked to and have given keynote presentations at podcasting conventions because of it. Somewhat controversially, because part of my message to other independent podcasters is that they're getting f***ed by the CPM rates, and people in podcasting advertising don't like hearing that or having it be heard. But Congressional Dish's continued existence is proof that it's true. Most other podcasters who are not famous or corporate-backed can only produce their show as hobbies. Very few are able to dedicate their entire careers to producing their podcasts. And no, I'm not filthy rich like Scott Galloway or Kara Swisher or Joe Rogan or Dak Shepard or Alex Cooper or any of the bazillionaires at the top of this industry, and I probably never will be. But I produce a podcast that I am extremely proud of. I spend my productive hours creating something that I want to exist in this world, and I'm funding it in a way that makes me feel proud, with no guilt whatsoever. And I do so along with a community of producers without whom this wouldn't be possible. You know, podcasting can be a very isolating career, but I'm not doing this alone. Every Venmo ding and every paper check removed from an envelope and every Patreon sign up is a reminder that we're all in this together. I'm so proud of what we have built with this community on a lot of levels, not only because we've found a way to get Congressional Dish to survive and thrive with a non-celebrity host, but because we're also proving that others can do this too. We're proving that it's possible in this fucked up world to create media that serves each other, not the corporations, and make enough to live a comfortable life. You know, until the Trump goons kidnap me in the middle of the night, along with the rest of the troublemakers, and ship us off to El Salvador. But, you know, every job has its downsides. But bottom line, if you're someone who has been refusing to pay for this show directly because, well, she should just take ads, well, I hope you better understand that no, that would not be better for me. And that would not be better for the show. And having your time sold to companies for far less than your time is worth, that would not be better for you either. And so that's why I fund the show this way. But it only works if I tell you and every other listener how it works. And if you're sick of hearing it, if hearing my funding pitches like our guilty fan makes you want to, quote, amputate your ears, unquote, then you can make these pitches go away by paying for the show. Everyone who pays for the show on Patreon doesn't hear these. They're completely removed. Only the people who listen to the free public version hear the funding pitches. The Patreon version also doesn't have the golf swing swear word censor, which is a censor we need to have in order to be listed in podcast directories in China, India, and some other countries that are cumulatively home to literally billions of potential listeners. So yeah, I hope that clears things up a bit. And I hope you will pay for the show if you get value from it now that you understand the podcasting financial landscape a bit better. And all of your options for paying us are on the support page on congressionaldish.com. All right, let's get back to the bill. So let's get started with the testimony from people who are asking for the AI dingleberry in the big, beautiful bill. Here's Sean Heather. He is the Senior Vice President of International Regulatory Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the lobbying organization for big business, where he has worked for 26 years.
We should not be in a rush to regulate. We need to get it right. And therefore, taking a time out to discuss it at a federal level is important. We would support a moratorium. Right.
So big business wants AI companies to be subject to no new laws or regulations. Shocking, I know. And so how do these guys suggest these technologies be governed? Well, here's Adam Thierer. He is a veteran of the Free Market Heritage Foundation, and he is now a senior fellow at the R Street Institute, which is another free market think tank.
Some have incorrectly claimed that an AI moratorium would leave consumers unprotected online. In reality, AI-related harms can already be addressed under many existing policies and court-based standards, including unfair and deceptive practices law, civil rights law, and other consumer protections.
And the big business guys think there is an avenue for new AI regulation under the 10-year moratorium.
Under an AI moratorium, state and local lawmakers would still be free to pass new technology-neutral rules so long as they don't interfere with the interstate commerce.
But what AI tech doesn't cross state lines? I can't really wrap my brain around that particular talking point, but they said it, so I figured you should hear it. And who is with these big business guys in Congress? Well, Representative Jay Obernolte, he's a backbencher, but he's a Republican out of California. And he outed himself proudly during the hearing as one of the big business co-conspirators.
So I just wanted to spend a minute talking about some of the things that have been said regarding the moratorium so far in this hearing. And I kind of feel an obligation to speak up as the chairman of the House AI Task Force last year. And as someone that kind of saw this group of 24 members of Congress from both sides they all come together on this issue, it really hurts my heart that it's being painted as such a divisive partisan issue, because I don't think it is. The assertion has been made that this was a last-minute thing, and in the dead of night, I think someone used the phrase, it was inserted, but I want to talk about the motivation here. It's been very alarming, as we have seen the first 5 months of this year go by, to see the number of bills introduced on the topic of AI regulation in state legislatures across the country. Over 1,000 now have been introduced. And this is what's lending urgency to this issue. We wanted to put some money into the reconciliation bill to bring the same productivity gains to federal government that we're seeing in private industry. But it quickly became apparent that it was going to be nonsensical to deploy $500 million to make that happen in federal government when this array of state legislation was going to interfere with the deployment of that effort, which is why we thought this was a timely time to do it. It's been asserted this is a giveaway to big tech. I strongly would push back on that. Big tech are the ones who have the regulatory sophistication to deal with 1,000 different state laws. The people who can't deal with that are two innovators in a garage trying to start the next OpenAI or the next Google. Those are the people that we're trying to protect. I know there's been pushback about the 10 years, that it's too long, that it's draconian. No one wants this to be 10 years, right? I would love to see this be months, not years. But I think it's important to send the message that everyone needs to be motivated to come to the table here. And also, let's not forget, it's been brought up, our experience with state privacy and the struggles that we've had to enact a preemptive federal privacy standard. Well, guess who are the chief people who are opposing that effort? It's the states. The states got out ahead of us. They feel a creative ownership over their frameworks, and they're the ones that are preventing us doing this now, which is an object lesson to us here of why we need a moratorium to prevent that from occurring in the case of AI. It's been asserted that this circumvents consumer protection laws. To anyone who thinks that, I would say, RTFB, read the freaking bill. Right? Because we specifically put language in there that says that as long as your law does not specifically target AI, you can continue to enforce it, which includes all of the state consumer protection laws, things about fraudulent and deceptive business practices. The intent was never to put a moratorium on those, and those will certainly apply to AI. As long as you don't specifically target AI with those bills, the states will be free to do that.
So I want to note here that he says that, and we know this because I did read the freaking bill, they're trying to give $500 million to the government for AI technologies. And he's afraid that state laws are going to get in the way of the feds deploying AI technologies. And the first thing that pops into my head when I hear that is federal government surveillance. So that's one of my bigger concerns. And I also just find it fascinating that the big business guys and this congressman are saying that they're doing this for, the small businesses. The big business guys, they care so much about their small business competitors that they are constantly gobbling up and squishing out of existence. Is that really their motivation? Or is maybe their motivation more guided by this? Here's Sean Heather again, the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Now let me turn to the EU AI Act. The Chamber believes the EU fails to achieve a balance between regulating risk and fostering innovation. First, Brussels failed to review its existing legal frameworks. AI is a technology, less so a product or service. Existing EU laws governing products and services are not suddenly made obsolete because of AI. Yet rather than carefully evaluating gaps in existing law, the EU chose to add a layer of regulatory complexity at the expense of innovation. Beyond the law, the EU also establishes a code of practice. While not currently mandatory, we are concerned that it will function as a de facto benchmark for evaluating industry compliance with the law. The code mandates extensive disclosure of sensitive business information to the regulator, downstream providers, competitors, including China, and potentially the public. This raises two major risks. First, releasing the know-how behind the technology could enable misuse of powerful AI systems. And second, forcing the value of IP being disclosed undermines investment incentives. So, why does this matter? Why not let Europe continue to regulate its way out of being a serious player on AI? First, we need partners. The transatlantic trade relationship is vital to the United States. Annually, trade in services alone is $475 billion, and we enjoy a $75 billion trade surplus. Our competitive advantage in AI will power the future of our trading relationship. Second, we need to prevent the spread of the EU AI Act from being adopted around the world and across the states. The EU's approach to AI is already being considered in places like South Korea, Canada, and Brazil. In the United States, the AI Act's influence is noticeable. States like Colorado, California, Texas, and Virginia have introduced AI regulations that echo Europe's approach. The Chamber is concerned that burdensome EU-like policies will be adopted domestically at the state level, potentially leading to a fragmented regulatory landscape across the United States. Third, we care because we must not allow American companies to be discriminated against. The AI Act's extraordinary extraterritorial reach imposes substantial compliance costs on U.S. business, diverting considerable resources away from innovation and undermining our competitive edge. From requiring non-EU companies to appoint authorized representatives to overly broad classifications of high-risk AI application directed at non-EU companies and more, the AI Act places American companies at a competitive disadvantage. By imposing these barriers, the EU risks not only harming U.S. businesses, but those discriminatory practices may also be replicated in other countries. Moreover, the Act opens the door for massive fines, as high as 7% of global annual sales.
And a Republican member of Congress seemed especially concerned about so-called American, but in reality, multinational tech companies being subject to fines for breaking laws. Here's Representative Gus Bill Reckes of Florida.
Since Europe's privacy law, the GDPR, went into effect, American companies have paid 83% of all fines levied by European regulators. I know you had mentioned this. That strikes me as an excessive means to subsidize their fiscal needs on the back of American businesses.
But is that an indictment of the EU laws? Or is that an indictment of Meta and Amazon and Uber and Google and their lack of privacy protections? Because it seems to me that they do have the option and the resources to just comply with the EU law. And if they are, here's the Chamber of Commerce's Sean Heather.
I would also point out that when these fines ultimately get before the European courts, American companies are actually having success. It takes a long time to get there, but the European courts have annulled these decisions in some cases and have reduced the fines.
So it seems like the EU justice system is treating the tech companies fairly. Even the Chamber of Commerce had to admit that that's true. But they clearly don't like that the EU is leading the way on governing AI, just like they led the way on creating privacy laws. Because regulatory compliance in the EU often requires compliance everywhere. So the EU privacy law, for example, is why you get to choose what cookies you're going to accept being put on your computer by websites, and why you get to authorize in what ways your use of websites is tracked. Big picture, the big business guys don't want to have to follow any AI-specific rules because, here's the free market think tanker Adam Thierer.
To win the so-called AI Cold War against China, America needs a forward-looking, investment-friendly national framework that keeps us on the cutting edge of the technological frontier.
An AI Cold War. Jesus. In the actual Cold War, that was a battle of economic systems. And the system that makes profit the center of everything is the system that won, at least for now. And so I guess this kind of fits. But just like how there are consequences for the rest of us in this economic system that funnels wealth to the few, in their AI Cold War, there are consequences for us as well. So here's Amba Cox. She is the co-executive director of the AI Now Institute, which is a think tank that focuses on the social consequences of the AI industry. I also think it's worth noting that before she joined this group, Amba was a senior advisor on artificial intelligence at the Federal Trade Commission, and right now she's on the board of directors at Signal, which is an app used because it encrypts its data and protects the privacy of its users.
Let's make this concrete and clarify what's really at stake here. Last year, a chatbot created by Character.ai lured a depressed 14-year-old from Orlando, Florida, Sewell Setzer III, to commit suicide. Character.ai isn't alone. Mark Zuckerberg tells us that these chatbots are a societal boon. After all, he thinks the average American has fewer than 3 friends, and the obvious solution, according to him, is to get people more attached to AI companions, just like he got our children hooked to social media. Meanwhile, AI voice cloning tech is enabling a new generation of scams that specifically target senior citizens. As just one example, a grandmother in Texas received a call from a voice indistinguishable from her grandson asking for bail money. It was a suspicious bank teller that intervened, but many, many others have not been so lucky. And in this new frenzy of chatbots and agents, it can be easy to forget that we actually already have a decade of far less shiny AI toys, the kinds that aren't used by people but are used on them. Inscrutable AI systems that cut the in-home care of 4,000 disabled people in Arkansas despite critical underlying medical conditions, or systems that falsely accused 40,000 people in Michigan of unemployment insurance fraud and denied them benefits. To state the obvious, AI is not a break from Silicon Valley's sins of the past, but merely a continuation, and it's also a market led and shaped by the very same players.
And later, this former member of the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, added,
I think it's important to note that when the FTC cracked down on Amazon Alexa for storing, voice prints of children long after they should have, their response was that, they were saving it indefinitely because AI. So AI has become a real free-for-all to trample on the rights of all consumers, but I would say with greatest threat to young people and children.
And here's what this consumer advocate thinks about the moratorium that's lurking inside the big, beautiful bill.
If this moratorium were to go through, American consumers would have even less protections than they have today against some of the worst AI abuses and exploitation. So just to give you an example of the kind of incentives we're already seeing proliferating, first, and I mentioned this in my testimony, we have new variants of scams, manipulative AI companions that are targeting those most vulnerable among us, not to mention our children. Number 2, we have opaque, inscrutable AI systems that hit directly at people's life chances, whether that's in education or in the housing market or even in healthcare. And finally, we're also seeing these secret algorithms use data about us, sensitive data, to hike up prices, to depress wages, and also to collude and rig markets that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
And remember how the big business guys were claiming that they wanted the moratorium because they care so much for their small business competitors? Well, here's a different perspective on what a regulatory free-for-all would look like for the smaller businesses in the AI space.
Now, when ChatGPT first launched in 2022, it seemed like this market was poised for disruption, with a new crop of challengers, new faces. But now, just more than 2 years later, it's clear that that bench is more of the same. Big tech and a few additional firms that are dependent on big tech for their survival. So put simply, building AI bigger and bigger requires enormous resources that these firms own and control. And so they play kingmaker for the downstream smaller players, the little guys that we're going to hear about today, controlling access to inputs and also pathways to reach the consumer.
And she got more specific about how the big tech companies are playing kingmaker.
I think we need disclosures across the AI supply chain, not just the deployers, but also the upstream developers, the big tech companies that are making this AI and aren't telling us what data they're using to build these systems. So they need to be telling us how the sausage is made or put together, so to speak. We also need it's smaller developers, it's small businesses down the line that also need this transparency from AI companies. We've seen big tech AI lobbyists argue that, they've sort of kicked the can down the road. When harms happen, it's the responsibility of these smaller firms, but the smaller firms don't have the information they need to be able to know why these harms are happening and to remedy them when they are.
And so getting back to the moratorium, here's some more of her testimony, but just so you know, in case you haven't heard Last Week in Congress, which are update episodes available only to Patreon supporters of this show, but she's going to mention the Take It Down Act, and this is a new law that was signed in mid-May, which requires online platforms to remove sexual images of people posted online without their permission, and imposes penalties, including prison and fines, for websites that refuse to do so in a certain amount of time. But back to her thoughts on the moratorium.
In this environment, the proposal for a sweeping moratorium on state AI-related legislation really flies in the face of common sense. We can't be treating the industry's worst players with kid gloves while leaving everyday people, workers, and children exposed to egregious forms of harm. In fact, there's some air to clear on what states have been up to in the first place. Approximately half of all proposed legislation from the states was on deepfakes. Notably, states moved well before the Take It Down Act recently passed Congress. Several others have moved to clamp down on the AI-related scams that I talked about. These bipartisan state measures have been nimble, they've been targeted, and they have weeded out the bad apples that nobody wants to be in business with. Another common sense theme across states: transparency, requiring disclosures to people affected by AI in sectors like healthcare, education, employment. I would argue really the bare minimum for an industry that derives its power from obscurity. And to be clear, we should be treating these measures as the floor, not the ceiling. A moratorium on AI-related state laws would, at a time when there are minimal federal laws in place, would instead set the clock back, and it would freeze it there.
So, opinion time here. Nothing about what I've heard about the laws being created by the states seems unreasonable to me. But there were concerns raised, perhaps disingenuously by the big business guys, but there were concerns raised about the effect that state regulation compliance could have on small businesses. Concerns echoed by the person asked to testify on behalf of the small business community.
My name is Mark Bargava, and I'm a managing director at General Catalyst, or GC for short. And we invest in and partner with leading entrepreneurs to build towards global innovation and applied artificial intelligence. We are committed to investing in an array of entrepreneurs, particularly in transformative technologies like artificial intelligence. A small sampling of the 800-plus startups we have backed over 25 years include Airbnb, Stripe, Canva, Anduril, Circle, Applied Intuition, Pacific Fusion, Commure, and many others.
And here's a question posed to him by Representative Tom Keene of New Jersey.
Given your background as a startup founder and venture capitalist, can you explain what the practical impacts of a patchwork of state regulations have on innovation?
Absolutely. I myself am a founder. I started a company in the digital asset space, which was then later acquired by Coinbase. And there, we had to operate across different states. And so it was very hard for us to compete with a larger company because we didn't have the lawyers or the compliance teams to be able to look from a state-by-state basis. It was very hard to actually compete in that sense. And so having a single national framework that's very clear, that has input from startups, is a much better approach just in general to innovation, not necessarily only specific to AI.
And one of the big business guys, Adam Thierer of the Free Market Think Tank, he gave an example of the confusion caused by state regulation.
Exactly how we define developer, deployer, integrator, consequential decision, all of these things, or even the term artificial intelligence, which is being defined differently in different state bills. If we can't even define the basic term we're here today to discuss at the state level, then that's a patchwork that's going to create huge problems for small businesses.
So confusion created by having laws written state by state, it does seem like a legit concern. And so here was the bottom line perspective of the small business representative.
inflexible or premature regulation risks, pushing innovation offshore and weakening our national and economic security. Alternatively as well, though, a complete absence of guardrails could lead to real societal harm and could erode the public trust. We deeply understand these dualities, and to accomplish these goals, we believe a national regulatory framework is preferable to a patchwork of state policies.
And what would he like to see in a national level law, which would have to be created by Congress?
The technology is changing very, very quickly, and it's hard to keep up with. So I think creating these guidelines are what's most important. And what I mean by that, for example, is a transparency guideline. So that could hit on what are the data sources, how do we train the model, how do we test the model. Also having kind of red teams come, and after there's an output in AI, a red team comes and tries to make it do something bad. So this is sort of a human testing of it. So putting in place these processes and these guidelines are the way to kind of have a framework on the national level rather than try to get too into the weeds because the technology is changing every 3 to 6 months.
But when it comes to that national framework, here's Representative Kathy Castor of Florida.
The problem is that you're putting the cart before the horse. You've now passed out of this committee a 10-year moratorium on all AI regulation at the state level before you even have that framework.
And that's the problem. Does it make sense to regulate AI technologies on the national level so that businesses can follow one set of rules? Yeah, I think so. But is there any sign that Congress is working on such a law? No, none. Instead, the Republican Congress is attempting to just stop regulation of AI in the United States altogether for 10 years, and in an incredibly shady way, via dingleberry on the big beautiful bill, which is a budget reconciliation bill, by the way, which means it's only supposed to contain budget-related issues. And this is clearly a massive policy decision. The moratorium being hidden within the big beautiful bill's 1,028 pages is inappropriate on every level. But the good news is that you can still pressure your members of Congress to get rid of it. And even though the big beautiful bill has already passed the House, the Senate is in the process of writing a different version. In order for it to become law, every single word of the big beautiful bill has to be identical when it passes both the House and the Senate, which means it's going to have to pass the House again. And so you should call everyone. Call both of your senators and your House member, because this is far from over. The number to get in touch with them is 202-224-3121. You know, assuming you don't want to meet the Terminator in real life. And after a 3-episode slump, I am thrilled to announce that the slump is over and we have an executive producer credit to announce. Now, if you're not in the know, you can become an executive producer every time you contribute a total of $535 to the show. The executive producer credit then allows you to put your name on one of the episodes you are most proud to have helped produce, because at that amount, that actually is a pretty decent chunk of what it costs to create the episode. But also, your executive producer credit moves your favorite episode up the most valuable episodes list, which is really helpful for new listeners of Congressional Dish, because that list is created by you. It is not my favorite episodes. It is your favorite episodes. They're quite literally the most valuable episodes. And so Mike Coverdale has decided that episode 288, which is called Government Funding 101, is one of our most valuable episodes. And he sent in a message. He said, quote, "I would like to boost Congressional Dish 288, Government Funding 101. I wrote Lauren earlier today to say I shared it with about 100 groups on Facebook and questioned whether or not she can tell if those shares resulted in any clicks, which I suppose would show as a burst of new viewers on that specific episode." Pausing his note, I guess we could kind of figure that out. It really depends on what you linked to. But yeah, it's tough. I don't actually know, because I would have to know the date that you did that to see if there's a boost. I'm going to kind of say no to that because there's just a lot of things I would have to know about that. But I mean, sharing the episode is always helpful. I find that people kind of have to hear about the show over and over again before they're finally like, oh, okay, I'll try it. Your efforts are appreciated, even if we can't really tell what's going on by the numbers. But back to his note, he said, "I've been listening to all the media coverage of Republicans having to admit they hadn't read sections of the bill they just voted on and that they would have voted against had they known. It has been quite a public outcry thinking members vote without reading the content, and something occurred to me. While the past norms have prevented either party from exposing the scam that few of them read the bills they vote on, this bizarre world of the Trump regime has ripped the bandage off. The public actually heard reports read off of what is actually in this bill, and many are outraged. It seems like your work is about to become more appreciated. Please use a producer credit on episode 288 and remind everyone to listen to it and share it widely. If you can succeed in getting people to see how badly Congress has failed, it may help them to turn this ship in a better direction. Now seems the time for you to resubmit queries to some of the key folks like Midas Touch, Kyle and friends, and even Rogan, who now seems to recognize that he's been played and may be receptive to hearing about the past, the process, and the corruption. I urge your listeners to reach out to the others they listen to and boost you as soon as possible. Thanks for all that you have done and continue to do, Mike. Thank you, Mike, for your continued support of this podcast. I think it's pretty safe to say that you have the most executive producer credits out of everyone in this community. I do like your idea. I'm always willing to go on these bigger podcasts, but I don't know these people and I've never been invited. And it's one of those things, like, I've tried to reach out myself and it's never worked. And so I think that the way this is going to have to work is if enough listeners badger these people with the bigger shows. You know, it's kind of like how I just said that people will try Congressional Dish after they hear the name enough. Well, I think these other podcasters will invite me on their shows when they hear my name enough. So far, they haven't heard it enough. So, but yeah, that would be very helpful if people are willing to do that. Okay, that's it for this episode. I have a couple more things in the works. We're definitely doing an episode about drones pretty soon. Yeah, looking at a few other hearings that happened this week. I don't know. It's all just madness right now. Like, I'm recording this with the BBC on in the background as Israel and Iran are now bombing each other. A senator was tackled yesterday trying to ask a question of our Department of Homeland Security secretary. There are giant protests tomorrow. I'm in Los Angeles where the National Guard and the Marines are being deployed, even though everything is completely peaceful here. It's just been a really psychotic week, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. But I'm here and I'm watching Congress, and I will let you know what they are doing, because there is some permanence to when Congress creates a law. So still got my eyes on it for you. Thanks for supporting the show, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
You know, we don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.